private funds have been betting big on food delivery, but there are growing signs of weakness. The latest with Uber today, with Uber Eats and Grubhub, and they've both taken hits. Ellen, what's the big challenge for these companies?
Well, I think as presented in Grubhub's earnings last week, the concern is that food delivery will never really make that much money. And this is something that Grubhub even told its investors, that the logistics part of the business, as opposed to advertising or other ways that these companies can get revenue, that logistics part may never really be a high profit business. And I think that spells some pretty troubled times ahead for some of these late stage private companies such as Postmates and DoorDash that are hoping to maybe go public, but haven't really pulled the trigger yet.
Can you give us a sense, Ellen, of how popular these food delivery services have been with private equity and venture funds?
Hugely popular. This is a place where even SoftBank has placed a bet on DoorDash in the hundreds of millions of dollars. They're really hoping that based on the market size and the habits that some people have around making these purchases all the time, that this is a really big market they want to be a part of. I think the issue that they're coming up against is these have always been framed as growth companies that are trying to get market share, trying to win. Unclear if they'll ever really be able to turn a profit, and that's becoming more important now as the public markets look to these growth companies and venture and are assessing whether they're a good investment or not.
Ellen, thank you so much for taking the time, and to all of our reporters. It brings us to our next guest, Bloomberg opinion columnist Conor, also a portfolio manager. And I'm wondering, Conor, from your perspective, there are so many issues that get raised by some of these food delivery services and the troubles that they've been having. The one is the economic fallout, and you raised this recently, particularly with restaurants. Can you explain?
Sure. So restaurants have been challenged by labor costs and just, the restaurants are always a low margin business, and so they've looked to delivery as a way to juice growth. And so, because DoorDash and Postmates and these companies have tried to gain market share and haven't been focused on profits, it's sort of been a symbiotic relationship between restaurants and delivery. But now if you have to see delivery companies cut back to get to profitability, it raises the question of what that's going to do to restaurant revenues downstream.
The other issue that I've seen raised is who invests in some of these meal delivery services. And we've seen that even mutual funds have been getting in before they go public to some of the private shares. How much of a concern is that?
I guess it depends on how much they've invested, because obviously you look at the share price of Grubhub after its earnings miss or Uber today, and the public markets is valuing this business a lot less than it was, say, 6 months ago. And yet earlier this year, private markets valued DoorDash and Postmates at a combined valuation of around $15 billion. And so if you have those on your books, the question is, where should you mark them, and what kind of write-down should you take?
Well, I mean, I guess that the concern that some people have raised is that the Fidelities of the world, and even the Vanguards, although less Vanguards, more Fidelity, have gotten into private shares right ahead of IPOs, and that they don't have to really value these shares on some sort of standard metric. So they might end up being able to have more flexibility in valuing these at much higher levels than the reality. I'm just wondering, do you view this as a systemic risk, or is this more of an idiosyncratic issue?
I would guess it's idiosyncratic for now, just because there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of widespread damage. I mean, there have been a lot of headlines this year, but in terms of dollars, I don't think it's significant relative to a $20 trillion U.S. equity market. But it's certainly a behavior that we have to look for going forward to see if they pull back or keep going.
When you wrote about the gig economy, when we talk about Uber Eats or even Uber or DoorDash, a lot of it hinges on the gig economy. You recently wrote that it's a dead end. Why did you say that?
Well, I think obviously Grubhub, as Ellen mentioned, has said that delivery will probably never be significantly profitable. And also, given the labor market we see with unemployment at 3.5%, wage growth rising the fastest for workers sort of the lower end of the labor market, Bank of America just actually raised their minimum wage to $20 an hour. And then you have legislation in places like California about how to classify these workers. It's just not clear where you're going to get the workers to run this business at a profitable level. So
when you talk about some of the companies that are seeing their valuations decline, and I know that you said that you view this as more of an idiosyncratic issue, when does it become systemic, given how much money has been funneled in?
I guess the question is first what the public markets decide these companies are worth, and then secondly, just in terms of how many dollars were invested at these companies at what prices, and then what can those mutual funds get for these companies at some, whether it's in private markets or public markets down the road. Going forward, do you think that private markets increasingly hold less value than even public equities at this point, given some of the pitfalls that we've seen? I think private markets have the attraction of not having that mark-to-market volatility, but it doesn't mean the risk has gone away. And so, sort of for this decade, they've had it both ways, where they've had the momentum and growth of these stocks without the volatility you see in public markets. And I just think we're sort of seeing a reckoning there, where ultimately stocks do go up and down in price, whether they're public or private.